in the New Testament, St. Peter and St. Paul both repeatedly urge wives to obey their husbands. And, they're of course, the most thorough, the most beautiful, the most frequently cited passage is Ephesians 5, where St. Paul says, husbands, you love your wives as Christ loves the church, and this self-sacrificial reference of the cross. But there's there's other places where they just say wives obey your husbands, and they don't even mention, husbands love your wives as wives love the church. As Christ loved the church. And there is a sense that among some people that, well, St. Peter and St. Paul were just using the language of their time, or they were just conceding to the fallen customs of the age. Why is that not the case?
Well, again, a couple things. I think that sometimes the test of things is time, and the church throughout its history, and I quote several popes in the book, looking at these passages and saying, no, husbands, you got to love your wives in a sacrificial manner and be the head of the family, be the head of the wife. And wives, be submissive, obey, don't obey in a way that is below your dignity. They don't always specify what that means, but they do say that. And so they've looked at it throughout history and interpreted it through the church's tradition as that there is a principle of authority within marriage. In terms of being a product of the culture, the early Christians were often known for being countercultural. They were the ones that, didn't believe in killing babies, didn't, refuse to eat the sacrificed meats. There was plenty of things that sort of set apart the Christians. They weren't afraid to be countercultural. So I'd say, that argument doesn't hold too much for me. But the bigger one, I think, is simply that throughout time, what the church in her teaching authority and her magisterium has taken from these scriptural passages and handed down through time is one which very assertively states that there is and needs to be a principle, I'd call it a principle of unity within the family, which includes this principle made possible by having a principle of authority.
Yeah, I think even in one of his allocutions to newlyweds, Pius XII even suggested, if I'm remembering correctly, that St. Paul was not talking to, he was not just reinforcing the custom of the time, because actually the people who, according to his historical claim in this allocution, is that the people he was writing to, I forget if it was the Ephesians or maybe the Corinthians or whoever it was, there was actually sort of a proto, what we might call as like liberated women in that time. And he wasn't just reinforcing and transforming what was a previous relationship of headship and obedience. He was also just restoring on the natural level that
what you were seeing. And actually, that's true. You do hear of those things, definitely, especially as the Roman Empire began to fall apart, was marriage and families were actually a mess. Women were leaving their families. Yes.
So it might not even be the case that was the prevalent custom, among all of the people that St. Paul was writing to. But obviously that's, people can agree or disagree on, historical claims, even in papal writings, of that nature. But it's just interesting.
Yeah.
Another thing that people say is sort of, well, this headship and obedience, this is a consequence, sort of the converse of what you were saying. Some of your students suggested that this is the consequence of the fall. Like the basic structure of headship and obedience, or at least of, authority and obedience, is a consequence of the fall, and it's something to be sort of ameliorated as much as possible. Like we should get away from thinking of it that way as much as possible. For example, and I don't know to what degree she would agree with that sort of example that I just laid out, but in Abigail Favale's new book on gender, the Genesis of Gender, she at one point she says there's no sense of hierarchy before the fall in the Genesis account. And I guess you could, I don't know exactly what she means by hierarchy, right? Because she could mean like a hierarchy of value or something like that. But it's just interesting to me that in Cassi Canubi, Pope Pius XI, He actually, I think he uses the words "the order of love." I think you quoted that in the book. He says that this relationship of authority and obedience are part of the order of love, which to me is a pretty clear sign that this is not just a result of fallen human nature, like, you know, having to work in a sort of tiresome way.
Right, right. And I think, again, the words of Genesis are sparse, right? And so in terms of, you know, how the relationship would have looked pre-fall, what we do know was that in that relationship, because when the one looked upon the other and there was no shame, to me that communicates what was experienced before the fall was union. Okay, and we don't have all of the pieces of the puzzle to explain why was that perfect union, that truly one flesh unit, why was that possible? Okay, but what we also see before the fall is, again, God's power, God's authority is established in and through the gift of creation. He is giving them their lives, their existence, this beautiful world, every good thing to eat, a mission, you know. So God is establishing his authority. He is the source. That's what the word authority means. He is the source of everything, and it is all good, right? And so when he does make this first covenant with Adam and Eve, you know, you shall eat of every tree that's good for food, but don't eat this tree, right? And so they have no reason to not trust that he's good, because he has established himself as giver. So I still think that we see a true expression of what authority is in God the Creator. Okay. Right. And then, of course, fast forward, even before we get to Ephesians 5, Jesus at the Last Supper, right? The washing of the feet. He is showing them an example. He says, if you want to be like me, this is what you got to do, right? He is their leader, right? And how does he relate to them? He's washing their feet. He's serving, okay? The leader as someone that gives and serves. And so to me, it's actually not a new form of leadership. It's just hearkening back to the original form of authority that we see with God in the garden, that God absolutely is establishing himself, his power. He's displaying his power through gift. So the specifics of how Adam and Eve are relating is, like I said, the words are very sparse. But what we see is that they have union. They have union, and then that union is broken, and we see the new distorted relationship between them is one of sort of neediness on the woman's part and a kind of use and domination on the man's part. So we see that does not bring union. Okay, so now fast forward to Ephesians 5, we have husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, right? How did he love the church, right? Laid down his life for her. Okay, and so for wives to be submissive to that, to me means nothing other than to receive and accept well what he is offering you. So I think that while it's not laid out super specifically before the fall, there's no reason to believe that the dynamic of giving and receiving between man and wife is that which would establish their union is somehow not there, because I think that it is. And then, of course, the whole middle part of the book, when I talk about the insights that St. Edith Stein and others have given us into the different ways in which man and woman sort of see themselves, the way in which they each have a distinct sense of sexual identity, absolutely sort of disposes them for this dynamic of being affirmed through the giving and receiving dynamic. So I think to say that there was no authority structure before the fall, you can say there was no sort of dominating power use structure, but that's kind of a bastardization of authority. I don't think that that's what authority actually means. Jesus makes it clear, and I think if you go all the way back to the beginning, we see, no, that's exactly what Adam and Eve were afraid to trust. They were afraid to trust that God was loving them and everything that he had offered to them. And actually, one more thing. Throughout the covenants of the Old Testament, in particular before the covenant at Mount Sinai, God would always, before inviting them into a covenant of trust with the chosen people, he would say things like, right, I am the Lord your God, the one who led you out of the land of Egypt. I led you out of slavery in Egypt. He would often remind them of all the good that he had done, the gifts that he had given them, before inviting them to trust in a new covenant. So to me, again and again, he establishes his authority by reminding them, I love you. I give you things. Look at what I've given you. You always forget, and so again and again, even there, we see that no, the image of God is not this controlling, manipulative God. That's what Eve was afraid of. That fear was what the devil preyed on. But I think that if you look at all of those pieces, that there's no reason, the structure of love, so to speak, requires asymmetry. And anyway, so I think that the argument can be made that the original, that of course there would have been that dynamic between Adam and Eve, but it was lived so perfectly. They just had this one flesh union and no shame. And it was just, we sort of saw we saw what union looked like there. We just didn't quite, it's not quite spelled out about how it was achieved.